I'm here in my backyard, and got a state park in my backyard, which is kind of nice here, and see lots of wildlife and stuff like that out here. But I'm going to give you guys a bit of a lecture today on chapter 2, and remember to ask questions, show up to the live Google Meets, and participate, guys. You have a great opportunity to still learn, to do some stuff, get credit, especially kids in AP classes. Work extra hard in whatever AP classes you might have. Try to get college credit, kids. Stay positive, communicate with your friends. There are lots of things you can still do, and before you know it, it'll be October 19, and we'll be back together face to face in person here, and we'll have a good time. But let's start chapter 2 here. All right, let's just kind of get here in the sun, and we'll kind of cover where we kind of left off from before. But all right, chapter 2. So guys, here I'll give you an opportunity to hit pause if you want to on this first part, so you can see it and take notes off of. But guys, chapter 2, there's a lot of disunity and differences in the English colonies from the start. Some of the colonies are actually quite different from one another. Just kind of give you an example here. The Puritans founded Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they were very strict with religious laws. So these laws called Blue Codes. At the same time, you look at like Pennsylvania, founded by the Quakers, and they're more religiously tolerant. Now they'll say like our views on religion are right, but it's a sin for us to force you. Whereas the Puritans are kicking and expelling people, kicking out and expelling people out of their colonies, actually kind of on a routine basis. And so you kind of have to kind of understand that. You look at Maryland. One of the initial purposes of Maryland, besides being a place for Lord Baltimore to make money off of, is Maryland is a refuge for Catholics coming out of England who are oppressed. Queen Elizabeth I, we're down here. And the Virginia is heavily Anglican, and that's the Church of England, the official state-sponsored Church of England. And so there's a lot of religious differences from colony to colony to colony. And so just kind of keep that in mind. You look at like New York, there's a lot of Protestantism there, but you have like the Dutch, and then you have the English, and they have their own kind of spins on that. And that's one of the reasons why New York is going to have a little bit more religious tolerance than some of the other places like Massachusetts or Connecticut, founded by the Puritans. And the colonies do not get along. Like, you might have this notion that all the colonies are in it together, and we're going to be this united country from the start. No, get that concept out of your mind, kids. Because the fact of the matter is, the colonies didn't get along to the point where, in 1644, Virginia is fighting the Powhatans, and parts are overrun, and they're in desperate help. And remember, it's slow communication back then. There's no highways, there's no cell phones, there's no internet, there's no telephone or telegraph. It takes a while to get communications, but they actually send up for help from Massachusetts and Connecticut, saying like, we need help. Can you send some able-bodied men down to help us fight the natives who are wreaking havoc on us? And they get a response basically back that, no, we're not going to help you because you guys have like the bad form of Christianity, the Puritans basically say. And it's just, quote, God punishing you guys down in Virginia. Well, the tables turn. You can see not much more than 30 years later, King Philip's War breaks out in the New England area, and Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island are getting pummeled by Native American attacks, and they send for help from people down in Virginia. And Virginia's basically like, yeah, you guys are on your own. You Puritans back in England in the Civil War beheaded King Charles I. Have fun with the Native Americans. We're down here safe. And so the colonies didn't get along from the start. And also, please notice that there's geographic distances. America is a vast wilderness in the colonial period, a vast wilderness. And the fact of the matter is, these colonies don't communicate much with one another. They communicate more with London than they do one another. And there's no highways. And yeah, there's a little bit of trade between the colonies, but it's not as much as you might think. Joint stock companies. This is one way that helps develop the New World. People can buy stock, just like you could buy stock in like a company like Amazon today, and then you technically own a little piece of the company of Amazon, and you have some voting say, and they might pay you some dividends or whatever. Not all, but some of the colonies, like Virginia, was started out as a joint stock company, where people can literally buy a share and own kind of like a little piece of the colony, and some of the profits of the colony are supposed to come back and then basically be sold for profit for the investors. And this is a way to raise money to start a colony. Buy my stock in my colony, and then you'll get some of the profits. And because you buy my stock, then I have a bunch of money up front that I can then turn around and invest. Remember, going across the ocean back then was expensive. Remember, it would take about 2 months. 2 months. It would take about 2 months. 2 months to go across the ocean back then, guys. 2 months. And so the Mayflower took 66 days. And so if you were going to send supplies over, you're talking, it's going to take about a third of the year to go there, drop off the supplies, maybe take on some new supplies, like food or fresh water, things like that, and then 2 months to get back. So you're looking at really like close to a third of a year, or a little bit over a third of the year, doing this, just doing a round trip, dropping off supplies. It's expensive, and you got to pay the whole boat crew, and it's expensive. And so you need to raise a lot of money doing this stuff. Jamestown. Jamestown becomes the English first permanent colony in the New World. Roanoke was prior, but they disappeared. We still don't know exactly. People are still trying to figure out what happened to them. Scientists have even done like genetic studies and tests of Native Americans and who are believed to have descended from that, Virginia, North Carolina area. And we just don't know. The honest truth is we don't know for sure what happened to them. But anyways, John Smith saves Jamestown. Jamestown was dying. There's this time period called the Starving Time. That early on at Jamestown, like everyone would get to share the food. And so whether you plant the food or not, you have an equal say to the food. Well, people would just go out looking for gold. The whole point of Jamestown was they thought that they would find gold like the Spanish. They're watching the Spanish, the English are, and they're bringing back boatloads of gold from the conquistadors, plundering, various societies, whether it be the Aztecs or whoever. And so the fact of the matter is, Spain is getting boatloads of gold back to Europe. It's upsetting and unbalancing the European economy, and England wants in on that action. So Jamestown initially thinks they're going to find gold. So a lot of people are just out looking for gold all day and not actually farming food, which is a big no-no. John Smith ends the Starving Time by saying, if you don't plant food, if you don't work in the fields, you don't eat. John Rolfe. Now, John Smith saves Jamestown from disappearing like Roanoke, you might say. But John Rolfe makes it profitable. How does John Rolfe make it profitable? Tobacco. Now, Spain there's different types of tobacco, and the kind of tobacco that Europeans like to smoke was like a more mild tobacco. And Spain had like their hands on it, and it was punishable by death to give a tobacco seed of this type of tobacco to anyone who wasn't a Spanish person. John Rolfe gets his hands on a tobacco seed, and nobody knows how. And he brings it to Jamestown, and he makes Jamestown profitable. Jamestown survives because of John Smith making people work. John Smith making the people have a peace treaty with Powhatan, which unfortunately falls apart as soon as he's gone. But John Rolfe, guys, tobacco makes it profitable. Now, don't touch this stuff. It makes you smell bad. It's expensive. It can kill you. It can ruin your endurance if you like to go running like a cross-country runner. Cancer, all that. But the honest truth is tobacco is what makes Jamestown profitable. Sir Edwin Sandys, he pronounced his name Sands. The Y is kind of silent, is my understanding. But he helps Virginia kind of settle up and become like big. And how does he do that, guys? Well, he encourages private ownership policies where people can move there and own their own land and kind of like settle up. Also, kind of moreover, he creates this thing called the House of Burgesses. So the Virginia General Assembly is considered the oldest continuous running assembly, legislative assembly in America. And there's two houses. In the one house is the House of Burgesses. And this encourages like middle class people to move over because they can be elected. And it's not just like nobility, aristocrats. The House of Burgesses is for people to get elected. So craftsmen and middle class people can kind of come over. The Burgesses, the word's related to bourgeoisie, like a solid middle class type people. Also a headright. You get you get a free 50-acre lot in some years, or a 50-acre lot for a small annual rent fee if you pay your own way over, or you get it if you pay for another immigrant to come over, because they're trying to populate the area. And this is actually popular for many, many, many years. Now, the honest truth is this. Now, Virginia needs labor. And so, guys, at first, some of the first Europeans here, they try to use Native Americans. They try to use Native Americans as their first labor source. And that doesn't work out well because just incidental contact between Europeans and Americans oftentimes leads to smallpox and other diseases. And so, guys, that doesn't work. But so what the English do, and they see the Spanish kind of fail with using Native Americans as a labor source, the English at first try to use indentured servants, poor whites. There's the slums of London, and these people are suffering and starving. And guys, it's not good for them. And so they basically say, hey, we'll bring you over, and you work for X amount of years. And it's really a case-by-case situation. Oftentimes, it's like 15 years. You're going to work for 15 years. And notice that would appeal more to a younger person than an older person. And it's almost exclusively men, these indentured servants, early on. And you're going to work for 15 years. And then at the end of 15 years, I'll give you a little bit of land and a little bit of money, and then you're free. But an indentured servant is technically a slave under contract, and if they leave before their time's up, that can be severely punishable. They can be arrested and forced back, and so it's not a fun time being an indentured servant. Technically, Ben Franklin is kind of an indentured servant growing up to his own brother, but that's a different story. It's technically he was born here. But that's kind of a different arrangement that had happened. Indentured servitude starts to die off in the 1650s. It starts happening in the 1640s, but it really accelerates in the 1650s. And it's replaced by slavery. As you see indentured servitude going down, you see slavery going up in modern-day Virginia and the other colonies, but especially Virginia. And what's the main reason why? England's economy starts to recover. And so there aren't as many desperate people. You have to be desperate to come over as an indentured servant. Yes, I'm going to be willing to be a slave for 15 years. But then also, a lot of stories trickle back to England that being an indentured servant, it just stinks. Guys, think about this a second. If you don't work hard enough, you can be punished. If you try to escape, you can be severely punished. But there's also stories about people dying of disease, dying from Native American attacks, dying in a boat coming over from England that gets, smashed at sea or whatever in a storm. But perhaps even most importantly, there are stories where these illiterate people which are the indentured servants, are forced to sign these contracts, and they don't understand everything in the contract. And when it gets to the end of the 15 years, 12 years, 20 years, whatever it is, on the case-by-case basis, they're like, oh, you forgot this part of the contract, so I have to set you free, but I don't have to honor, giving you a little bit of land or giving you a little bit of money. And so people don't want to become indentured servants anymore. You can imagine. Chesapeake. This is an area where the Chesapeake Bay is. Virginia, Maryland, the Chesapeake Bay. And it's famous for having navigable rivers. So these rivers go inland, and they're navigable, meaning that you can get big boats up and down them. And so then it helps, because there are no highways, there are no semi-trucks, there are no trains. That helps the interior develop, because a lot of plantations where they're farming the tobacco are relatively close to a river. And then once you get in a river, it's easy to transport it out. It's harder to transport it over land. What are they farming? What do they need all this labor for? At first, indentured slaves and servants, indentured servants, and then slaves. Tobacco's the first big one, and this leads to the rise of plantations and the need for all that labor. Do you think there'll be more or less women than in the northern colonies, based on hearing all this physical labor? Less women. The southern colonies start off overwhelmingly as male, and the northern colonies, the southern colonies are overwhelmingly, at least in the 1600s, young men looking for work. Northern colonies are oftentimes families moving over, escaping religious persecution. So the northern colonies tend to have more women, southern colonies less women. New England colonies. These are think NE New England, NE Northeast, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. Some of you might be thinking, what about Maine and Vermont? Maine doesn't exist yet. That's a part of Massachusetts. Vermont doesn't exist yet. Both New Hampshire and New York both claim Vermont is a part of them. Eventually Vermont says, no, we're neither, and we're our own thing. But Massachusetts is the principal, meaning the key New England colony. And the first people there are Pilgrims, and only 100 Pilgrims come over. The Pilgrims are separatists because they want to separate themselves from the Church of England. They want to separate themselves from the Church of England. P-I-L, Pilgrims, P-I-L, pillage. That's probably a bad analogy. But they just want to tear down the Church of England. The Church of England, they think, is too Catholic-like. It's too corrupt. They just want to tear it down and start over. And they come over on the Mayflower. And what's important about the Mayflower boat is that they all come up with this Mayflower Compact. All of the adult men and the Pilgrims, they agree to this contract, the Mayflower Compact. And some people point to it and say it's like an early constitution almost. And they create Plymouth Colony, which is a modern-day city in Massachusetts, and it's going to get absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony and Plymouth Colony are going to merge into one, more them absorbing them, and then it's going to form Massachusetts. William Bradford's their famous governor and famous leader. And remember, they have a hard time. I mean, they suffer. They lose half their people in the first year and a half. And they also come over and during the Little Ice Age, so it's bad farming time. It's sandy soil. It's not good. But one of the best things for the Pilgrims is they have this man named Squanto. They meet Squanto. One of the first Native Americans they meet is Squanto, and they're shocked because Squanto comes up and Squanto says in English, hello. And they're like, what the crap? We travel halfway around the world. We find an indigenous person who can speak English. And Squanto has a long, sad story. Squanto had been kidnapped off the coast of modern-day Massachusetts by a Spanish boat, and had been brought to work as a slave on an island out in the middle of the Atlantic for Spain. An English minister had actually purchased him taught him English, taught him Christianity and all that, and then sent him back home. To make the story even more sad, when he finally gets home, he finds that the Spanish ship had introduced disease incidentally. There's no evidence it was on purpose. No, sometimes there is evidence on purpose, but in this particular case, a lot of it just spread just by the fact that people were there coming over from Europe. But the fact of the matter is, basically his family's dead, almost most of his tribe's wiped out, and then he has to go merge with a different tribe. But Squanto helps forge good relationships between the Poconoco people and the Pilgrims. And so they get off on the right foot. And their relationship actually lasts for decades pretty well. But then eventually more and more Puritans come, and the Pilgrims are just a small amount of next to nothing. I believe the number is about 10%. So think about this. Only about 100 Pilgrims came here. Half died. And some of those that didn't die were like counting kids of two parents. So it's actually less than 50 people when you look at it like that. But it's estimated about 10% of Americans today have at least one ancestor that came over on the Mayflower, which shows, and the Pilgrims were famous for having lots of kids too. The Puritans are similar to the Pilgrims. They come over to Massachusetts. They're not quite as extreme. Now, they have some more extreme religious beliefs, but they're not quite as extreme in the sense they don't want to break down the Church of England. They want to purify the Church of England, remain loyal to the Church of England. Few Pilgrims ever came. Thousands and thousands of Puritans came. And you have this thing called the Great Migration in the 1620s, in the 1630s. And they come over in huge numbers, family units, and they reproduce big, big numbers. And so Massachusetts really, although it's kind of, you could argue, started by the Pilgrims, the Puritans, it's their influence. They start the Massachusetts Bay Colony, merges with Plymouth Colony to form Massachusetts. But their cities are like Salem, Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts. John Winthrop, he comes over and he preaches this sermon. He's this minister, this city on a hill, about how they're going to have this charity and they're going to be this example for, quote, good Christian behavior. And the whole world's going to kind of look at them and model them if they do well, or ridicule them if they don't do well. So they have to behave. And John Winthrop, it's all about community. And they're going to have community churches and community schools. And if a farmer breaks his leg, all the other able-bodied men will help his farmland. Very community. But at the same time, while it's very community, you disagree with the Puritan ideal, you're exiled from the community. You get punished. You get locked in a stockade, with your neck and arms sticking out of the wood lock. So there's all sorts of things. John Winthrop exiles Anne Hutchinson. Here we go, Rhode Island. Rhode Island is actually started by Roger Williams. He gets exiled by the Puritans. And Roger Williams preaches Christian tolerance. Why are Christians persecuting one another, whether they be Catholic or Puritan or Anglican? He says it doesn't make any sense. He preaches religious tolerance, and even talks about paying Native Americans for land and having religious tolerance for people. And so Rhode Island was founded more on kind of like some of these peaceful notions. Anne Hutchinson gets exiled. She gets punished in both Massachusetts and Connecticut, two Puritan colonies. And Roger Williams invites her to come on down to Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson becomes the first known woman to found a city. Portsmouth, Rhode Island, still around today. Oldest known city to be founded by a woman here in the United States. And she's an antinomianist. And she basically says that you don't need the church to experience divine inspiration. You don't have to follow the laws of your church. You don't have to follow the moral laws of your society. This threatens the Puritan church, who is like very much the laws are based on their views of Christianity. And Hutchinson said, through the grace or like goodwill of God and your faith in Jesus, you are forgiven of violating any moral laws of a church or society as long as you're living by what you believe is right and so forth and so forth. They kick her out and she's actually honestly lucky to come out of here alive. Just kind of because of that. But you can see what she's kind of preaching here. Very similar to Roger Williams toleration, and as long as you're living peacefully, we're going to leave you alone type mentality. New York is first founded by the Dutch. New York was actually called New Amsterdam. And you look at like a lot of the New York names, Manhattan, Harlem, or Staten Island, are all Dutch names. Even look at some of the modern things like the Holland Tunnel, the New York Knickerbockers, the Knicks, their NBA team. England conquers it and takes it over. The Dutch willingly give it to them in exchange for islands they took over from the English in the Pacific. There's lots of fighting between the European powers in the colonial eras. Because the Dutch found it with their own version of Protestantism, and then you have the English moving in with their own versions of Protestantism, New York ends up having more religious tolerance than a place like Massachusetts or Connecticut. Rhode Island has religious tolerance too. Pennsylvania has religious tolerance because the Quakers found it. And the Quakers preach religious equality. Basically, the Quakers believe... So they believe in God, and they say God made everyone, and they made everyone as an equal reflection of himself, and that God, and notice the kind of the gender there, there's still kind of a gender bias, but they say that includes not just races but genders, and so they preach for giving women more rights, and they preach. Maybe they say maybe our way is the right way of thinking on religion, but it's a sin for us to force you. They're pacifists, and if you're pacifists, you don't use violence, and so they're a little bit more tolerant. Because of this, the Quakers quickly become a minority in their own colony because the Quakers aren't going to persecute them. Unfortunately, the lesson the Puritans get out of this is we need to be more oppressive against any dissent. Because we were oppressed, the Puritans were oppressed back in England and discriminated against. So they wanted to create Massachusetts as a place for their religious freedom. And they're worried if they become a minority again, they'll get persecuted. So what do? They persecute anyone who's different from them. So they have the secure stranglehold on the government and the way of life, so they won't become persecuted again in the future like they had been in the past and back in old world England. William Penn is the founder. Strange little story. William Penn says, they say, William Penn, you're the founder of this colony. We want to name the colony after you. And he says, no, you can't name this colony after me, William Penn. And so the Quakers naming it say, okay, we'll honor your word. We're not going to name this colony after you, William Penn Jr. We're going to name it after your dad, William Penn Sr. So Pennsylvania means Penn's Woods, William Penn Sr.'s Woods. Not named after William Penn because he said, you can't name it after me. They named it after his father, William Penn Sr. Very nice. Georgia. Oh, Philadelphia actually means the city of brotherly love, which follows into that whole pacifism, tolerance, equality type stuff. Oh, and you think about it, in future chapters, you will see that the Quakers are more likely to be abolitionists, meaning wanting to end the institution of slavery. And that kind of goes back to their views on religious equality. And the Quakers are more likely to stand up for women's rights. The Quakers are a tiny percentage of America, yet they're overrepresented, disproportionately overrepresented as abolitionists and women's rights activists, suffragettes, and things like that. Georgia is founded by James Oglethorpe. And Georgia is kind of an interesting one because it's kind of like a colony that nobody really technically really wants to live in. Because it's swamps, it's near Spain, and Spain's always trying to attack England, and it's not a good time. And so, guys, basically here, they let debtors out of prison. The prisons were overflowing, prisons are expensive. We just let out a bunch of undesirable people and put them in these undesirable swamps with the gators and mosquitoes with malaria. It's near Spain. Spain attacks English. So you put them down in Georgia. Georgia's the farthest south English colony in what would become the United States. Guys, we're almost done here. Look, we're going to finish chapter 2. Look, we got that. You can hit pause right there if you want a screen full of it. But there we go, guys. Glorious Revolution, 1688. After the English Civil War, the Stuarts are back on the throne, but the Stuarts are pro-Catholic. And the Protestant and the pro-Protestant parliament gets upset, and they have this bloodless revolution where they throw out they chase off the Catholic Stuarts and put in place William and Mary of Orange from the Netherlands. They have English, royalty ties, but they're Protestant, and that's the most important thing. And this does two very significant things to England at the time. Number one is it secures Parliament's strong power as they make the next king and queen, and it establishes the Parliament as a secure dominant force. We can run off a king, we can make a king. And it secures Protestantism. Why are the Stuarts chased off? Because they're more pro-Catholic. Unfortunately, England back then is very anti-Catholic, and they had good reasons too. I guess there's never good reasons to be that discriminatory, but they had their reasons in the sense that the Pope had ordered Spanish countries to attack and take over England and force them back under the Catholic Church and and so forth, which heightened a lot of the fears. And the Glorious Revolution, it's important to America because it spills over into the British North American colonies. For example, in Boston, Sir Edmund Andrews, that's how that's pronounced, Andrews, he's overthrown. He was hated. They didn't like him. They didn't like some of his tax policies and how he would punish people. And Puritans chase him off. And so they chase off James II. He's a Stuart king who gets removed from power. And the Puritans don't even wait for the new king and queen, William and Mary. They basically just say, hey, we chase off the royal governor and in the name of the new people. Unfortunately, William and Mary do not allow the local colonial people to select the governors, though. New York, this is kind of a sad story. Leicesters Rebellion. When Leicester hears about the Glorious Revolution, this bloodless revolution, or essentially bloodless revolution over in England, which secures Protestantism in the Parliament in England by replacing the Stuarts, people like James II, with William and Mary of Orange, Leicester takes the fort in New York, basically in the New York City that guards like their harbor, and he takes it in the name of William and Mary. But William and Mary technically didn't ask him to do it. And he takes control of New York and he starts implementing democratic reforms. Leicester starts saying, hey, we're all going to vote. And they didn't have that right. The people living in New York didn't have that right back then. They didn't have the right to vote. And so a lot of historians see Leicester as this pro-democracy guy, this great guy who's doing some great things and implementing reforms for the little guys and the middle class. Whereas New York City back then had been dominated by the elite Dutch traders, and the rich English people had kind of like dominated New York. He's giving more power to the middle class. Basically, to make a long story short, Sloughter is the new guy picked by William and Mary. And when he comes and he knocks on the fort and he basically says, give me possession of the fort. And Leicester says, did you come in the name of William and Mary? And Sloughter refuses to answer the question, even though he was sent by William and Mary. Leicester's like, I will give you the fort if you can tell me that you were sent by William and Mary. And so, hold on one second, buddy. Hold on one second, I'm almost done. And so basically, Sloughter basically refuses to say he's sent by William and Mary. Leicester says, I'll give you the fort, I'll give you the city, if you prove to me you're sent by William and Mary. I took this fort in their name. And Leicester hesitates and refuses to give the fort to Sloughter because Sloughter's refusing to show proof even though he has proof. There's this stalemate that lasts days. Eventually, the kind of word starts leaking out that Sloughter is legit sent by William and Mary. And to make a long story short, Leicester then gives up the fort. He's seized as a traitor. And the elite Dutch and the elite English people, upset with all the democratic changes that Leicester is making, are demanding he gets put on trial for treason against William and Mary, even though he took the fort in their name. Said he would give it as long as they showed him up the fort, as long as they showed him proof he was sent by them. And to make a long story short, Leicester, there's like this kangaroo court, meaning kind of like it's a foregone conclusion, and they basically have a quick trial, a quick carrying out of the sentence, and he is executed. And kind of disturbingly, I've heard different ways about how he died. I don't know which one's real, but I've heard one of the ways that he died supposedly was, one of the stories was, they hung him up gently by the neck, not so it would break the neck, but so he'd have the sensation of suffocation. But then before he died, they cut him down, strapped him down, cut open his belly, had a fire next to him, threw his intestines into the fire while he was still alive, and then beheaded him and chopped off his arms and legs for being a traitor to the king and queen, William and Mary. And then basically, when word gets back to William and Mary, all of the details, he gets pardoned. But at that point, it doesn't matter if pencils have erasers, because you've already executed him in a brutally horrific way. But Leicesters kind of seen by historians as instituting democratic change, and then the elite Dutch and elite English kind of smash it down, right? And then last thing, in Maryland, the Protestants used this to gain power, which had been started as like kind of like a place for Catholic refuge, ease and stuff like that, because they started to get persecuted in England at various times. And the good news is, in Maryland, though, they end up passing this law saying it doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Protestant, you're going to have equal political rights. But that's chapter 2. Let me know if you have any questions. You can send me an email. You can put them in the comments. But let me know, guys. But stay positive. Stay strong. And, guys, you can do it. Have a good day.